Hello and welcome. Today I'm going to take a theo-historical analysis of Carol Quigley's book Tragedy and Hope, which truly analyzes the structures and power dynamics and personality principles that operate on the Anglo-American sphere of the global world empire, of the impact of Britain and the United States and Canada, the Anglo-American or English-speaking world, the power structures that run our countries that have existed since for hundreds of years, but especially took preponderance in the early 20th century, reaching into our own times, the Anglo sphere power structures, which really center around the investment bankers. They're called merchant bankers in Britain, but they're called investment bankers in America. Really, the financiers, as the quote from Carol Quigley has right here. I'll read it to you. I'll read it to you. The powers of financial capitalism had a far reaching plan, nothing less than to create a world system of financial control in private hands, able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole, Carol Quigley notes in this book. But what do I say when I say let's take a theo-historical perspective to it? Right? Remember what I've discussed in my past research. What is theo-historical? It's reading history but knowing that the scriptures are the core history. The scriptures are the core history of humanity. God isn't absent in the sky. God isn't off to the side. He is in the center of history. And so, even with the English speaking world in the 20th century, God was allowing Satan to do certain things, entice the whole world through its obsession with money, power, with wealth, with classism. Especially in the West, we have classism. If you aren't wealthy, people don't believe you're intelligent. If you're not wealthy, you will never attain political power in the United States of America. Now we're taking a theo-historical perspective of Carol Quigley's work. I won't cover the whole work. I'll just say the key crux points that stuck out to me in the reading of Tragedy and Hope, and also why does a Christian man even participate in reading a history book? Why do we participate? Well, it's because our three roles as Christian men are to be prophet, priest, and king. And part of being a king to order the ranks arrays of men around you, underneath of you, as a servant leader. But part of the training to being a king is having scientific knowledge, and especially knowledge of human history and human society, such that you can speak forward words that make sense of the reality we live in. And then you can order your church, you can order your friends groups, you can order, and you're doing this together. You're not unilaterally just a tyrant in doing this. As a king, you are reordering reality around you. You're helping people make sense of the world around us. We're all intimately, intrinsically interested in politics as the organization of power. This book talks about how power is organized historically. It's the history of a single lifetime, about 70 or 80 years over Carol Quigley's lifetime from 1890 to 1966. And we learn this because we're trying to be Christian kings. We're trying to be Christian kings, and part of being a king is having scientific and historical knowledge. So Christians should read history books. They shouldn't focus on the news cycles, because news cycles are meant to suck you in and make you feel hopeless, despondent, fearful, and hateful. But you should read history books to understand our place in history. I believe that. I wouldn't read books outside the Bible if I didn't believe there was utility in understanding history outside the Bible. But that's part of our kingly function, having scientific and historical knowledge for the church. You must know world history, but then you must have a theo-historical analysis, a kingdom analysis, where you take God as a core of history, and you know that God is omnipresent, and God is omnipotent, and God is omniscient, which means that He directs history to His purposes. So, what is the crux of tragedy and hope? It's that quote I read to you there. The powers of financial capitalism had a far reaching plan, nothing less than to create a world system of financial control in private hands, able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole. Our countries in America and Britain had the biggest elite networks of financiers, central banks, investment banks, financial conglomerates. And about the year 1939, Carol Quigley talks about how this financial control still remained, but it transitioned into monopoly capitalism, where the leaders of the world of the West were monopoly capitalists like David Rockefeller, even though he was still an investment banker. He had interest in monopolies. The CEOs of our biggest corporations form entities of power within themselves. With tragedy and hope, it begins with a hearty discussion of the transition of civilizations, how the West has undergone several phases of rebirth and regrowth and expansion, wars, resurrections, expansions, and in America and in Canada and in Britain, the financiers they've spun a web. A spider web is the best way to conceive of it. Their system of monetary control, especially before World War One and immediately after World War One, the gold standard. The gold standard was their ways of controlling their wealth. If money was valuable, then they were rich. If their money was valuable, then they were rich. So bankers were always interested in deflating the value of the currency because they held the money. They want to deflate the ability of people to pay for things. They want to hold on to the money and make the money more valuable so that less money buys more and more goods. Inflation is when more money buys less goods. The bankers want to deflate the currency so that what they hold, their less money, buys more and more goods, has more and more purchasing power, has more and more purchasing power parity and wealth that they retain to themselves. And before World War One, as Carol Quigley says, there's the system of money was such like it was like this. Okay, there was a cone. At the bottom of the cone was the gold reserves. Then there was fractional reserve. There's at the bottom of the cone was gold reserves. With a certain amount of gold reserves, they could get deposits in their bank, and with a certain amount of deposits, they could get credit and what is called money, the money in the circulation. Gold at the base of the cone is gold, then deposits, the money that people leave in the banks, and then the credit and the money that actually circulates at the top. And with fractional reserve banking, they could lend out about, I think he says, one one $1 worth of gold could create $100 worth of money. So you have $1 worth of gold in reserve, and you have $100 in circulation because of fractional reserve banking. Fractional reserve banking. Where because we know that not everybody's going to panic and rush the bank at the same time, we can then lend out 10x times 10x, 100 times more money than we have in reserve in gold or deposits, right? And then World War One came. With World War One, each country became very proficient at producing industrial manufactures and agriculture output. And so after World War One, every country wanted to have an autarky, a self-sufficient economy, autarky, economic autarky, and they wanted to sell their manufacturers or sell their agricultural products that nobody wanted to buy. At the same time, the bankers wanted to get back on the gold standard because they'd gone off during the war. They wanted to get back on the gold standard. This was called stabilization, but the gold standard system wouldn't work anymore. And so when they tried to the 20s to transition back to gold, they had to go through deflation, depression, and then, of course, the system was so shaky that by 1929, the banks collapsed because they'd been floating securities and loans and credit that was on unstable basis. They couldn't cover the basis. Basically, they didn't have enough in reserve to cover what they loaned out in securities, what was owned in securities, and the world economy, instead of producing during the 1920s, it was supposed to produce real wealth that could be purchased, and that would increase the living standard of the working class. But the bankers didn't want the working class to live better. They wanted to retain the wealth themselves and all their power, because with wealth comes power, right? It's not just that I get richer and the working class get richer. As a banker, you're thinking, when they're richer, I have less power. So I want the working class, their standard of living to go down, and me retain all the money like a miser, and then I get to dictate all the terms to the rest of the country, and I can buy politicians. And he talks about in this how J.P. Morgan, the father, senior, and the J.P. Morgan, the father, and J.P. Morgan, the son, and the Rockefellers, John Rockefeller, the original John Rockefeller, they in 1907 they controlled both candidates in the U.S. elections for president. I forget who it said. I think it was uh, who was elected in 1907? I forget who was elected. Maybe Teddy Roosevelt or somebody. It was somebody. It's something where they controlled both candidates in the presidential election, in 1907. Right? The Morgan one side, Rockefeller the other side, but they shared power together in America. And so, if you think about World War One and World War Two, the bankers retain control through World War One. They try to get back on the gold standard, and then that system is too shaky, so it collapses. The economies of the world have evolved so much from the First World War that everybody's producing industrial goods, raw materials, and foodstuffs and stuff like that. Nobody wants to sell. Nobody wants to buy, but everyone wants to sell their goods, and so each country is getting stronger economically. And then the financial capitalists, because of measures they put in to get back on the gold standard, this paved the way for the rise of monopoly capitalism for corporations to take over the world. Because now industry, corporations, production corporations that manufactured industrial goods and that manufactured chemicals and then manufactured things, they didn't need the financial powers anymore because they could get enough money out of the population from selling their goods and from borrowing and with stocks and bonds and things like this that they didn't need the banks to give them loans anymore. So monopoly capitalism took off after 1939. But what happened in World War II with the Anglo-Sphere? If you look at it like peaks of mountains, before World War One, in the year 1900 or 1914, in America, it was J.P. Morgan and John Rockefeller that had all the power, that had all the money, all the power. They had political networks where they controlled who was elected to presidential politics, to Congress, things like that. That was a initial peak in 1914, and then during World War II and after World War II, the monopoly capitalists, the head of the CEOs of big companies, they were a second peak. So the first peak is financial capitalism. It's controlled through J.P. Morgan. The second peak is monopoly capitalism with its peak through the Rockefellers, especially David Rockefeller took over the Rockefeller legacy. John Jr. and David Rockefeller that controlled most ExxonMobil, other holding companies, stocks and bonds, many financial control, many monopolistic control of companies and corporations. So the first peak's 1914. The financial capitalists at the peak of their power before World War One, and then after World War II, the monopoly capitalism takes over. What is happening in the continent of Europe with Russia, the USSR, the communists in the USSR, and the Germans with the Third Reich, National Socialists, is that I think that the West had such advanced technology and aeronautics, airplanes, bombing technology. They invented the atomic bomb, which was the hardest feat to pull off out of all the countries. They had the most bombs, artillery, men, resources. When Germany, the Third Reich, and the USSR were scrambling for men, resources, and time, the Americans, and the British had all these things: men, resources, time. They had the brain power. They made committees that research into technology to make their bombing campaigns more efficient and more deadly. All right, when they're bombing Germany and Japan out of existence. When they're If they had fought the Soviets, they would have defeated the Soviets. It would have been a very massive Titanic battle. And the Soviets were very powerful when they swept through Germany with their army, their land army. But the thing about America and Britain is that we're separated by water and air, and we can transverse those waterways, and those sky lanes, right? We can touch you, we can bomb you, but you can't bomb us. It's basically, we can hold you at arm's length and bomb. That's the Western power, and the bankers that if you read books like I have here by Anthony C. Sutton, I just cursorily gone through these. How Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution, Anthony C. Sutton, and Wall Street and the rise of Hitler, how the financiers, even like when National Socialists were buying the newspaper Volkisch or Bielbacher, it was America. It was an American loan through Ernst Hofstangl, the German American businessman that gave $1,000 American loan in American dollars, $1,000 to the National Socialists to buy the Volkisch or Bielbacher, which was their main newspaper in Munich, Berlin, right? So the financiers they financed the Bolsheviks, they financed National Socialists, and they won a war of attrition where they let the scorpion fight the snake, they let the Russians fight the Germans, wear each other out, and the West gets wealthier and wealthier because all the production from the war, World War II, made America the dominant power in the world. It could produce more boats, ships, manufacturers, agriculture, everything. They won the war. They became the organized capitalist economy of the world. And so the West The Americans and the English are playing this game where they allow their enemies, and as it says in Tragedy and Hope, the key point of the British and the Americans was to wear out the Austro-Hungarian Empire in World War One, and the Russian Tsars in World War One, and then again to those same countries, Germany and Russia, wear out the Third Reich and wear out the communists, and they succeeded at this. All the think tanks, all the stratagem of the Western powers during World War One and World War Two worked because the East, Middle Europe, Germany, and the East, Russia, is weakened, and the Western part of Europe, America and Britain and Western Europe, have all the power. They have all the production power, all the wealth, all the money. They use their wealth, their money to finance everything, and they retain all wealth and money themselves. And the bankers, of course, want the value of their money to go up, the value of their asset classes to go up, and it's exactly what happened after World War II. Except after World War II, I think there was expansion in real wealth, actual production of goods, where the working class could buy goods. That lasted from 1945, 1975. The working class wages went up in the working class. This was a rare interregnum period from 1945 to 1975 where the working class actually did get economic power. But since the 70s, the real wages of workers in the West hasn't gone up that much, right? Since the 80s and 70s. So with that, there's the peaks: financial capitalism, 1914; monopoly capitalism, 1939. And the people that control the world today are technocrats and their managers, their technicians, their CEOs, and they meet at Bilderberg, like I have here, by Daniel Esselin, the Bilderberg Group, the top 300 central banker, the top 100 central banker. There's 300 men that meet here. 100 are central bankers, 100 are presidents and prime ministers or cabinets, and 100 are CEOs of monopoly corporations. CEOs of monopoly corporations, the Bilderberg Group, and that's just one of their networks of control. The real control happens with the Rothschilds and Rockefellers, and the lackeys like Larry Fink that they have running for them now, the big bankers, investment bankers they have running for them now. And these are additive layers where financial capitalism came in first, and then monopoly capitalism, then a pluralistic economy, and now we live in a technocracy where the leaders of the corporations are also technologists and they're technocrats, like the WHO, Fauci is a technocrat, where Klaus Schwab is arguing for technocrats to take over. This is what's planned from Tragedy and Hope, as he saw unfolding the end, although the full fruition of it comes in our own time. But why do we know this? Where does God come into all this? Well, God is sovereign, and God allows the Luciferian temptation of the world. He does. He lets Lucifer, just like with Job, Lucifer is allowed to tempt the world into worship of power, money, and worldly wisdom, and himself, and elevating themselves. These men that run the world, they elevate themselves to their highest point of worship. They elevate their own self-image. It's self-idolatry in their own self-image. They've opted to be wealthy. They've opted to be powerful. They've opted to make designs of murderous intent on the world. And so what happens is that this is a Luciferian temptation that we all have, and you have less of this temptation when you're in the working class, because I've noticed in the West. I went to university in southwestern Ontario, and I noticed that all the city kids had never worked a labor job. They didn't have tastes that ran the same as a working class person. They never worked with their hands or a labor job or in the dirt or anything outside. They preemptorily shut down everything I was saying when I was in university. I would demonstrate that I know more about history than them, but they would shut me down, and it's like they're saying like, "Why is this peasant talking to us? This bloody peasant, like Monty Python, right? Bloody peasant, shut up." Like they don't, even if you demonstrate superior knowledge or know-how or intelligence or knowledge of history or greater wisdom, the upper classes in the West, and this is in Canada, this is in southwestern Ontario, so London, Ontario, Toronto. These people that go to university, they have a classist system that worships themselves, worship their own image, and they love philosophy, they love worldly wisdom because it gives them another reason to elevate themselves. But if you're in the lower classes and you came from a small town like I did, Walsburg, Ontario, which is like a Rust Belt town, it's like Flint, Michigan, only on a smaller scale. If you came from a small town like I did, you're working class. I think you'll never be respected by the elites that have all the money, the classism, the family aristocracies that go back, that they count on. And what was I going to say? What was the other thing? So being from a small town. Here's what I was going to say. Being from a small town, I still live in a small town. I live in Chatham, Ontario. It's 30 minutes from where I was born and raised. Wellsburg, Ontario. But being in a small town, I know for a fact, I know with absolute certainty that every face that I see, whether it be at the grocery store or be at my church or be on the street, nobody in this town is in the halls of power or has any institutional power. It's quite enjoyable because you don't have to even. We're the working class, but we don't even have to be surrounded by the elites. The elites go off to major cities: Toronto, Ottawa, Montreal. The Laurentian consensus on that quarter from Toronto to Montreal, or in America they go to Washington D.C., New York, and Silicon Valley. And people in small towns don't even have to put up with these elites because we don't see them face to face. They don't see us face to face. The billionaires don't see anybody face to face. They go from private jet to private domicile to private offices in their corporations, and they ride in limos where they have tinted windows where they don't even look. They don't even want to look at the untouchables, the people on the street. But people in a small town, I will never come into contact with them with the elite institutional power. I came into some contact with some people at Western University, but these people weren't high up in the ranks. They were just at the lower levels of the ranks, probably. But they did go on to be elite lawyers, things like this. And that was my contact with the upper classes, and they just peremptorily shut down everything I said, even though I'm demonstrating superior knowledge of like Russian history, the Russian Revolution, the Stalinist Revolution, European history, World War II. It doesn't matter. I'm a peasant in the lower classes. They'd say bloody peasant. And they tell you to be quiet, and they shut you down, right? But being in a small town or being far away from the elite power centers, you never have to see any of these people. But they are still up to their no good business. But they had the loose fairy temptation. The working class has, like from the movie It's a Wonderful Life, like George Bailey. We have the opportunity to live a rich life, helping each other, helping your local church, helping your local town, having being loved by many friends, being loved by many other people, many families, having an eternal family in the Church of Jesus Christ at your church. You have this. You have this. You get to be like George Bailey, where it says, "A man with friends is not poor. A man who has friends is not poor." And as his brother says to him in the movie, to the richest man in town, George Bailey, because George Bailey has helped out all these people. He's scrimped and he's fought and he's worked hard and he's scrimped and saved and he's figured out how to save money on the smallest details that people can buy houses. This is the important work. If you're working class, don't try to inject yourself or eat or fly up, or climb up the ladder in the class system. It's a satanic system that they worship themselves, they worship their idols, they worship philosophy, they worship knowledge, they worship money and power and classism and their family history, their aristocratic family history. But we get the opportunity to live the true gospel. The blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. The meek shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who thirst after righteousness, for they shall see justice. All these things belong to the poor, the working class. We get to live a real substantial life, helping real flesh and blood people that are friends that we love. So with this, leave them in peace, leave in Jesus' name. God bless. Take care. Bye bye.